you to Natalia and the new center here. I'm delighted that a forum like this has been established. I was especially glad to see, as I looked at the setup and looked at their new website, that they are doing translation in both Ukrainian, of course, but also in Russian. And I think that goes to one of the points that I would make as being among the highest priorities right now at this moment of crisis for Ukraine, which is emphasizing national unity. And certainly for the United States, as we reaffirm our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. One of the most important dimensions of that is that it applies to all of Ukraine. In this regard, I was encouraged by what I saw yesterday around the country. It was wonderful to be out at Shevchenko Park on Sunday morning and to see the laying of wreaths, but also to hear the clear message from a number of political parties speaking directly to eastern Ukraine, to Donetsk, to Kharkiv, emphasizing that all of Ukraine stands together. And I think it was striking to see the news yesterday of large pro-national unity demonstrations in Odessa. Saw some others in eastern Ukraine as well. I am a huge fan of what Mayor Sotheby has been doing in Lviv with Speak Russia Day and the support to reach out across the country, because there's obviously an active campaign right now to stir dissension, to stir division. I was amazed to read, and I haven't confirmed this yet, but so I'll be interested if others know if it's actually a true fact, but I was amazed to read this morning a report that somebody was burning a Shakhtar flag in Donetsk, and I'm pretty sure that anybody who was doing that did not come from Ukraine, and certainly didn't come from the Donbass. And I think that's a reminder that there appears to be, as several of you in the International Press Corps have reported, an active campaign to stir division and stir dissension in Ukraine today. And that's something that all of us need to stand against. And I think the best answer to that is the message of unity and national engagement that's come from Prime Minister Yatsenyuk and others. We, of course, had Secretary of State Kerry here last week. And I think for me, one of the most powerful memories from that visit was the messages of unity that came first here on Institutska when he met with a broad array of religious leaders, Orthodox, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, but also in his meeting with Rada leaders, and as he met with everybody from Oleg Tyanybok to Serhiy Tihipko, and heard a clear message of commitment to elections on May 25th, to competing honestly and fairly and moving this country forward. A couple of other quick points I would make before we get to questions. One, of course, is to simply reaffirm the United States' strongest support for the new democratic Ukraine, for the efforts that Ukrainians across the political spectrum are making to move this country forward. We have a concrete reflection of that in the very important meeting that the White House will host, President Obama's invitation to Prime Minister Yatsenyuk to meet on Wednesday. This will be an opportunity for the White House, for the U.S. government to reaffirm our strong support to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian people, but also to consult and to hear the Prime Minister's thoughts on how to navigate through the important challenges that are ahead. None more important than the economic work that has to be done to put Ukraine back on the path to economic health, to political health. Also, of course, critically, the question of Crimea and the invasion that has occurred there. Let me talk just for a second on the question of Crimea, which I know everybody will want to raise issues on, so I'll be brief here, but just to note, from an American standpoint, the very strong view that there is no military solution to this crisis. This is a crisis which needs to be solved diplomatically. The Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian military forces in Crimea have an exceptional record so far of resisting the provocations, the provokatia, that are clearly being undertaken by the Russian forces on the ground, trying to drive towards some kind of a military confrontation. I have been impressed by the courage and the determination that the Ukrainian forces have demonstrated in resisting these provocations. And I would hope very much that the Ukrainian government, that Ukraine's military leaders, the Minister of Defense, Andrei Porube, all of whom I've spoken with in recent days, will stick to that course, and certainly that's the message that I've received from them as well. And then finally, lastly, fourth issue, just to flag briefly for everybody, the question of the diplomacy. And there will be some things that I can't say at this point because there's a lot of high-level discussion going on. But just to underline for all of you, the commitment that the United States has to exerting every effort to see the success of the diplomatic process that has begun, as you've seen from the various White House and other sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. We are convinced that the deployment of observers stand. With that in mind, we have, as you all, let me stop at that, and great. Thanks, Yorina.
Okay, we'll start with some questions.
Dario Fuban from AFP News Agency. I was just wondering, in terms of... Sorry, Dario Fuban from AFP News Agency. I was just wondering, in terms of the executive order, or have you actually started applying any of those sanctions? And also
that are working on the investigation about finances. And also I'd like to know, they've been to export more gas.
I think I'll leave it to my European colleagues to announce who else has been involved in this area. On the question of energy security, let me just underline, this has been one of my priorities from my first day here in Kyiv. And I've worked very hard with both our companies, but also the U.S. government, Department of Energy, Department of State, to see what more we can do from a strategic standpoint to strengthen Ukraine's energy security, to enhance its energy diversification. The good news is that this economy is so far down in terms of the modernization of its energy sector that there's a lot that can be gained even without massive new imports, simply by improving efficiency, boosting what's happening in the nuclear sector, enhancing reverse flow from Western Europe. All of these are mechanisms to reduce, as was already happening, but to reduce further Ukraine's reliance on with Russia. Energy and energy imports and energy transit is obviously a part of that. Russia is considered, well, let me say, and not militarily. And that's a position not just of the United States government, but in fact was reaffirmed at the North Atlantic Council in Brussels last weekend. On the question of our security relationship, our bilateral security relationship with Ukraine, we have had, since independence for 22 years, a strong security partnership, security assistance, training. One recent example that I will flag for you is that the Ukrainian Navy's most capable warship, the Sagadachny, has just redeployed from a cruise off the Horn of Africa, where it was part of the NATO anti-piracy mission. So we used, this is under the Yanukovych government, where we had worked with the Ukrainian Navy to fit out the Sagadachny and make sure that she was seaworthy and able to conduct the anti-piracy mission with NATO and European partners, which she performed quite well in. So this is at this point a matter of continuing the work that we've already been doing.
Go over here.
Hello, Jamie Detmer, Daily Beast and Voice of America.
Of course, I'm not going to speak on intelligence matters, so nice try on that one. On the question of gas supplies, again, I would just underline, this is an area which has been extraordinarily dynamic even before the crisis in Ukraine. America's emergence as a significant gas exporter, and I've not seen the final numbers for 2013, but I remember in the last quarter we were the largest gas exporter in the world. This obviously changes global energy trade significantly, and it's something which Ukraine stands to benefit from. But Ukraine also, again, to recall, one of the important breakthroughs in the U.S.-Ukraine economic relationship that happened over the past few years was the agreement between the Ukrainian government and American oil and gas majors for shale gas exploitation. This is an area where Ukraine has substantial potential and substantial assets. So aside from everything that can be done in terms of efficiency, in terms of re-exports, in terms of alternative sourcing, there's also a very real prospect that Ukraine itself becomes a substantial gas producer, which obviously changes the whole energy dynamic of the region.
So that's in the longer term. In the shorter term, can America assist any shortfall in gas?
Has already begun to change global markets. Whether molecules of that North American gas come. No, thank you for the question. Let me say two things on this. The United States believes, as Secretary of State Kerry and President Obama said last week, that Crimea is and should remain a part of Ukraine. Discussion over. That said, I have been encouraged to see comments from Prime Minister Yatsenyuk and others indicating that the government, the Ukrainian government, is open to enhanced levels of autonomy for the people in Crimea. But this is something that A, Ukrainians have to decide within their own constitutional framework, and B, it can't happen under the barrel of a gun. It has to happen through a rule of law constitutional process. So that would be my answer to both sides of that question. Again, I think on this, you would have to ask Ambassador Tombinsky or my European colleagues. But I want to be very clear. The United States is not prepared to recognize any result of the so-called referendum that's going to be happening 6 days from today. We are committed to Crimea's status as a part of Ukraine.
Yugoslavia, and listening to comments from Secretary Kerry recently, I didn't feel like the Secretary made it exactly clear what's the difference, in the current situation in Crimea from what happened in Kosovo. And second question is, given that the situation in Crimea doesn't look too good at the moment, what measures would the U.S. be considering to try to make sure that the situation doesn't spread to other Russian-speaking areas in eastern Ukraine? Thank you.
Yeah. Again, let me be pretty short on this one. I think analogies like this are always dangerous, sort of apples and oranges or apples and watermelons. That said, the most obvious critical difference is the presence of tens of thousands of Russian forces who are de facto occupying Crimea at this moment. The presence of these gangs of thugs who I've seen beating activists in Crimea, creating an atmosphere of intimidation. So, again, apples and watermelons.
Just pass the microphone down.
The second part of the question, did you want to answer that? Sorry. About measures that the U.S. might consider taking to prevent the situation from spreading to other areas of eastern Ukraine?
No, well, I think it's not really for the United States to prevent anything. It's for the government and people of Ukraine. But as I said in my opening and most important initial remark, the steps that the Ukrainian government has been taking to reach out, to engage with Russian-speaking populations, the welcome step of acting President Turchinov not to sign the change to the language law. All of these are positive gestures, and we hope very much that the government will continue to look for those opportunities, because as far as I can tell, and again, I'm interested in hearing from those of you who've been traveling in the oblasts, but as far as I can tell, that strategy so far appears to be succeeding. And the Ukrainian people, from Donetsk to Lviv, are saying to Moscow, please leave our country alone. Let's have a normal, healthy relationship.
Pass the microphone.
Great question, because it really is important that justice is done in that case. At this point, we are looking principally to the Council of Europe, which has been assigned a leading role in terms of working with the rest of the international community to investigate the crimes, the violence which took place throughout February, and to see that justice is done. We do not have a specific request from the Ukrainian government at this point, for any kind of U.S. forensic assistance with the investigations. But certainly we will be as supportive as we possibly can of the work that the Council of Europe is doing, and we think that that's an excellent forum to move ahead.
Hi, Luke Harding from The Guardian, over here. Ambassador, you mentioned this active campaign of dissension.
To talk about shale gas. And you had the full spectrum of political parties there, including UDAR and Businessmen's Party and other opposition groups. But it was also one of the most democratic discussions that I had seen in my first months in Ukraine. And frankly, it was not that different from the kind of discussion that you would have before a state legislature. Let me answer the second question first, because it's easier. You know, we have a rule of law system. I have no control over what the U.S. Department of Justice does, and I am sure they will pursue leads and crimes wherever they point. On the question of the overall environment, let me make a couple of observations. First, I think, you know, for all of us who were here on the 21st of February, it's extraordinary that when police and law enforcement essentially disappeared from the streets of Kyiv and throughout the country, there was no looting, there was no violence, there was no burning of buildings or burning of stores. Somebody who grew up in Southern California and remembers the Rodney King riots, I have great admiration for the moral authority that the Ukrainian people, the moral authority that the Ukrainian people demonstrated. And I think it's a reflection of, for me, you know, one of the most extraordinary aspects of the Maidan itself over the past 3 months has been the moral dimension. You know, the fact that, at least in my experience, over 3 months of walking through the Maidan and walking down Rashadit, I never once saw somebody drinking openly. And when there were people who had been drinking, you saw them getting turned around by the Sotnia. An extraordinary comment on the moral dimensions of this, and I would commend to all of you who haven't seen it an interview that ran yesterday on NBC in the United States on Meet the Press with one of our Catholic bishops, who's talking about this dimension of the Maidan and of Ukraine's political challenges, because it's gone under-commented in the Western press, but it's an important aspect. So first, you know, credit to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian people, including the Samoborona, for having maintained a disciplined environment. And I remember my own first visit to the Rada after the change in government on Sunday, so it would have been the 23rd, you know, driving up there and this extraordinary scene as you had, first of all, thousands of people from Kyiv coming to see their new democratic parliament, but also all of the self-defense forces providing the only security that was managing the location. We have been strongly encouraging the government, including senior security officials, to move as fast as possible with demobilization, reintegration, normalization of the security environment. There's obviously been tremendous progress in that regard. If you go by the cabinet ministry today, instead of rows of Berkut, which is what you had for months, or rows of Samoborona, what you have today is a couple of guys standing around and an integrated force, both presidential security and the self-defense forces. It's important that that process continue, that the government's monopoly on force be regularized through the integration of these forces. At my own residence, I was encouraged to see this weekend that the special branch police who stand outside my residence put their uniforms back on today. And I think that's a sign of normalcy returning to Kyiv. I was also encouraged to see the signs, you know, that here on the Maidan, the Samoborona have been instructed, no more baseball bats, no more balaclavas. Life is returning to normal. Certainly speaking for the United States, we will be prepared, and I have conveyed this to the Deputy Prime Minister and to the Chairman of the National Security Defense Council, among others, that the United States is prepared to work with Ukraine and our other international partners as the government seeks to build a new police. You know, this is an institution not just the Berkut, but the whole security establishment was to a significant degree discredited by the violence that was inflicted on the Ukrainian people through the course of the Maidan demonstrations. And I think the government, I know, the government is conscious of the requirement to build a new police force that goes with a new country, which means a police which is democratic, accountable. Again, the fact that you have the traffic police, who of course were the original target of Avtomaidan, the fact that they're back out on the streets. But they're out on the streets, in the cars with a Ukrainian flag and a blue and yellow stripe on the side. So this is a work in progress. We hope it will move as fast as possible. In part, to go back to one of the other questions, because progress on that score takes away some of the ludicrous arguments that have been made in the Russian press about the security climate here. Thanks, Henry. I guess I'd say two things. First of all, I should note, our partnership with Europe and Ukraine is as close as it's been, as close as any place I've ever worked. We have exactly the same strategic objectives. We have excellent cooperation, and it is an environment where we get the best of each other's diplomacy. That being said, I really don't want to speak for future European steps, but I know, including from the phone calls that Secretary Kerry and President Obama have been engaged in over the weekend, that Europe's views are exactly the same as ours regarding the illegality of the invasion of Crimea and the importance of restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity. But I think I'll have to defer to Ambassador Tombinsky on the question of the timing.
Thank you. Mr. Pyatt, do you have your own data? How many Russian and Ukrainian soldiers are now present?
To address Russia's legitimate interests in Crimea in a way that... Okay. Thanks for those. Both very good questions. Let me say first on the financial side, there are at least three dimensions to our support at this stage. First, of course, is the $1 billion loan guarantee, which Secretary Kerry announced in conjunction with his visit last week. As you all saw, this requires congressional approval in our system. The House moved very, very quickly last week, and I saw language this morning as the Senate begins the same process, so that's moving ahead. Secondly, we are committed to working with the government, working with the very technically strong economic team that has been named here at the Economy Ministry, the Finance Ministry, and I think you have the minister coming this afternoon, the new central bank head, but working with all of them to tackle the technical issues that Ukraine confronts. And then the third pillar, as you alluded to, is doing what we can to help unpack the enormous kleptocracy which surrounded the Yanukovych government. A lot of you have been involved with the superb work that has been done by investigative journalists here through YanukovychLeaks.org and others to unpack the information which was left behind as Yanukovych fled Meshnahirya, as Mr. Kurchenko abandoned his company. We are very interested in working with the government to support its investigation of those financial crimes. And we have already on the ground here in Ukraine experts from the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Department of the Treasury who are working with their Ukrainian counterparts to support the Ukrainian investigation. Also working with other international partners. There are a variety of other governments who are also interested in this through the international financial networks to uncover the financial crimes that were committed by the previous regime and to see what can be done to recuperate some of those assets. On the question of sanctions, briefly to explain, first of all, everybody will remember that in February, the United States announced visa sanctions against a variety of Ukrainian officials all the way up the chain of command who had been involved or implicated in the egregious violence that had taken place against the Maidan demonstrators. These sanctions were leveled even before the shootings that took place outside here on Institutska on the 20th. Additionally, the White House announced last week additional visa revocations hinged to the violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty reflected in the invasion of Crimea. There is an additional tool which the White House unveiled last week, which was the executive order, which provides additional mechanisms in order to sanction those involved in these same offenses. The White House has not yet announced how that tool will be used, but it is on the table, and it reflects, as Deputy National Security Advisor Tony Blinken said yesterday, our resolve to raise the cost for Russia and for those in Crimea who've been involved in the violation of international law.
We've got two more over here, and then we'll move over.
Switch on. Oh. Greta Huber, German TV said to them, would the United States be able to match the lack of gas, the possible?
As I said, I want to be a little circumspect in talking about the live diplomacy that's going on right now, but just to underline, we are very supportive of the efforts that are underway to establish such a contact group. But the most important thing that needs to happen is direct dialogue between Kyiv and Moscow. Russians and Ukrainians need to be talking about the issues that have arisen. And to the extent the contact group can be something that facilitates that direct dialogue, it's something that the United States will support significantly.
Ministerial seats in cabinet. So how would you give a kind of nuanced reply to that critique from Moscow?
No, well, thanks for the question. And let me answer it in two ways. First of all, I think anybody who's here in Kyiv, walking around over the weekend, sees that there are no pogroms underway. And as the leaders of Ukraine's Jewish community have made clear, the suggestion that this city has been taken over by fascists or radical extremists is unfounded. That said, we have been very clear, including in our communications with what used to be called the opposition, that we are very concerned about anything which looks like it's drifting towards fascism, anti-Semitism. In this regard, I would note we have been positively impressed by the positive evolution of Svoboda's role as part of the opposition, the role that they have played in the Rada, the role that Mr. Tanyabok played in signing the February 21st agreement, and in helping to maintain a united opposition front. We have been clear, and I have been clear with him from our first meetings back in probably it would have been August, that for the United States, the use of anti-Semitic symbols, the use of intolerant language is a red line. It will inhibit any normal relationship between Svoboda and the government of the United States. And as I said, I have been reassured by what I've heard from Svoboda leaders privately with me, but also by the public role that they have played. And I think it would be a mistake to suggest that a party which polled about 10% in the last Rada elections, and which controls government in several Western oblasts, is somehow illegitimate. I think they have demonstrated their democratic bona fides. It seems like a lifetime ago, but I remember back in September when I was in Lviv, I spent an afternoon. Thank you. The United States will support whoever is selected in a democratic election, whoever is chosen by the Ukrainian people. The important thing about this election is that it be free and fair, meet international standards with wide international observation, and produce the strongest candidate with the strongest democratic mandate to take the country forward.
We'll do two more.
We obviously have our own judgment. It is consistent with the numbers that the global market is reshaping itself. Which suffered so terribly under Stalin, under Hitler. You know, the history of the Holocaust here is as awful as it is anywhere in Europe. And I think it is in many ways, it's a defining part of Ukraine's history. And so for any political party not to honor and respect that history, and to honor and respect the important role that the Jewish community in particular plays here, is very dangerous and is also probably a recipe for political irrelevance.
Just to follow that up, are you concerned though about